Grant Robertson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm sure my colleagues will soon be able to take a call on this important part one of the inquiries bill. Mr. Mallard, in an interesting exposition on part one, covered the material around exactly what this part does. It establishes the purpose of the inquiries bill, and in particular runs through a set of the changes that are set out in the Act for how an inquiry can be established. And I think it's quite clear, Mr. Chair, that across the House there's an enthusiasm for a range of different inquiries. As Mr. Mallard said, at the moment we have the Royal Commission, the big kahuna of inquiries, at one end of the spectrum, and we have ministerial inquiries at the other. In the middle there is a grey area that needs to be filled and is filled by the public inquiry function and the ministerial inquiry function that are established under this Act. Mr. Chair, there has been no better recent example for me for why the purpose clause of this bill is needed than the David Henry inquiry. And today in the Privileges Committee we were treated to an absolute circus. We had David Henry himself, the person who allegedly was undertaking the inquiry, telling us what he thought his powers and parameters were. Well, he was undertaking it under a terms of reference set by the Prime Minister, which Mr. Henry was quite clear enabled him to, for example, get Andrea Vance's swipe card records. But then, moments later, we had Andrew Kibblewhite, the Chief Executive of the Prime Minister's Department, and Wayne Eagleson, the Chief of Staff in the Prime Minister's office, come in and say that this inquiry's terms of reference didn't give Mr. Henry that power, or in the case of Mr. Eagleson, he said he had not contemplated that it might give that power. There was complete confusion. It appeared that nobody knew what the parameters of this inquiry were. And of course the inquiry itself was fundamentally undermined, Mr. Chair, by the fact that it didn't have the powers that are given through the purpose clause here, which is the power to call witnesses and to call them under oath. Because had Mr. Henry had that power, we might actually know for sure today who leaked the Kitteridge report. Because as at today, we have an accusation that Peter Dunn leaked the Kitteridge report, but we have no actual proof of that because Mr. Dunn denies it. Quite categorically denies it. So, well, that's right. My colleague, Mr. Lees-Galloway, asked who else it might have been. If an inquiry were established, Mr. Chair, if an inquiry were established under the... yeah, we'll come back to that. If an inquiry was established under the purpose clause that is we're debating here in part one, it would have a range of powers and duties and privileges as outlined in section 2B. And that includes the ability to call witnesses on oath. That ability was not there. And today in the Privileges Committee, David Henry was asked, well, why didn't you go, in fact it was Kennedy Graham who asked him actually, why didn't you go back and get some more powers? You know, you were charged with finding out who did this, who leaked the Kitteridge report. Why didn't you go back? And I don't think he answered the question. I certainly don't recall a definitive answer from him. And, you know, that raises a number of questions about when sometimes ministers call for inquiries, they don't really want to know the result. And it may be that John Key didn't really want to know who leaked the Kitteridge report. But today, what we have is an inquiry that was unable to fulfil its function. And its function was to get to the bottom of who leaked the Kitteridge report. Under this piece of legislation, that inquiry would have significantly wider powers, or the ability to have significantly wider powers, including calling people on oath. And for that reason alone, Mr. Chair, this bill is worthy of support. I want to raise a couple of other points, and I'm not going to speak for much longer because I know my colleagues are very keen to do it, but I want to raise another point within this part, and that's in the interpretation section. And it's the question of who the appointing minister is and who the appropriate minister is. In the Henry inquiry, let's just be absolutely clear. John Key was what would have been the appointing minister under here, and I believe the appointing minister of an inquiry has some responsibilities to actually ensure that the inquiry takes place in the way that it is meant to. I think that's what's meant by the wording in here. Unfortunately, John Key fell well short of that. I hope any future inquiry that he is part of that might be established under this Act, he would actually take a more active approach and ensure that those inquiries were dealt with properly. But, Mr Chair, part 1 is a reasonably good part.
Holly Walker.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Well, I'm pleased to take a call in